This is great to see all of you here. How many are from Washington? Anybody? Portland? All right. People who got up early, go down. Bless you. Yeah, I want to welcome you to the Murray McDonald Conference Center. Our host is Mr. Kent Huey back here. We thank him very much for making this fine place available to us. It's going to be a good place for Tom to make his presentation. I want to introduce our business associate, Richard Price, back there. Richard and I are responsible for building the technical infrastructure here. It's fairly automated. We have this thing full of computers, a room back there full of computers, our projection system. This is sponsored by Mopan and the Oregon Film and Video Office. We were fortunate to be able to persuade Tom Sawyer to come up. I told him we could ride around in my old green pickup truck, and I thought that was going to be great, so he was willing to come up. Tom has taught at UCLA. He speaks at writers' conferences around the country. He was producer and head writer for Murder, She Wrote, also for the blog Jerry McGraw. He has 100 television episodes to his credit, 9 pilots, 1 opera. And without much more ado, I'd like to introduce Tom Sawyer.
Made the trip over here, and I hope it'll be worth a while. I'm going to talk about writing in general, script writing in particular, and really it's about things that I've learned in television that seem to apply to all kinds of writing, whether it's screenwriting or writing poetry or even writing sermons. And I'm going to begin with a kind of an approach, a mindset, a philosophy of writing, which is that no matter what it is you're writing, you're an entertainer. It's very important to get that into your head. You want people to pay attention to what it is you're writing or what you're saying if you're giving a talk. And it's, you know, on the face of it, I suppose it's a little tacky to look at it that way, but it's a very realistic way to look at it. And I've given talks. I gave a talk at a Baptist Writers Conference in Green Lake, Wisconsin a few years ago, and of the 350 people who showed up, who were, many of them want to be writers, 50 of them were ministers who wanted to learn how to hold their audience. And so that's really what we're talking about, is hanging on to your audience. We all have stories we'd like to tell. But we need people to pay attention. And especially in television, of course, as a television writer, you learn that very quickly. There is a mandate in television that, again, kind of cold-blooded, but it translates to any kind of writing. And that is that the writer's job in television is to deliver the audience to the commercial break, because that's who's paying the bills. If they dial out before you get to the commercial break, you're not doing your job as a television writer. And so every word that I have written in television, I have written with an image in mind. And the image is that of my viewer. And my particular viewer in my imagination is a guy sitting in his t-shirt with a beer in one hand and a clicker in the other, and he's just come home from another day at a job that he despises. And he must be entertained, and if I bore him for 1 second, he's going to click to the next channel and I've lost him. Well, that's not a bad way to think about whatever it is you're writing. You want people to stay with you, whether it's a novel, a short story, whatever it is. And so, you know, the mandate that we have in television, I think, travels very well, even to movies. You know, we all, I'm sure most of us, complain about the kind of movies that get made these days, and why don't they make them like they used to, and all of that. And I think a little more of the television writer's mandate would help in movies. There are some other problems with today's movies which we'll address later in terms of the writing and construction. I'd like to move on. By the way, I'm going to break this up into 2 hours, so we'll take a break in roughly 45, 50 minutes. And if you have, by the way, any questions at all, please raise your hand. If there's anything you don't understand, I'd be happy to explain it, and don't feel that you're interrupting. It often helps. There are some rules in writing. Almost all of them can be broken, but there are a few that are not arguable, and one of them is giving your audience, your readers, satisfaction. The great Russian playwright Anton Chekhov, I'm sure many of you have heard of this or know about it, posited that if, as the curtain goes up in Act 1 of a play, there is a rifle over the fireplace on the wall, it has to be used by the end of the show. And that applies to, I mean, it's fundamental to any kind of writing, and especially because a rifle is such a very pregnant symbol. The audience, you, we, all of us, we're used to being told stories. And once that rifle appears, we're sitting there waiting for it to be used, whether we know it or not. And it makes us crazy if it isn't used. I'll give you an example of a movie that was done in the last few years. It was a blockbuster movie, a thriller about a young man who's being pursued by a big government agency. Will Smith played the young man, and naturally, being the only one I lost the title for the movie, but he was being pursued. He had what we call a MacGuffin. I'll tell you what a MacGuffin is later. He had a tape with some military secrets in his pocket. He didn't know he had them. And he was being pursued by this super secret government agency that could do anything. They could see through walls. They could, no matter where you were in the city, they could track you. Or in the country, or in the world. They had satellites, they had black helicopters, they had all this stuff. And for some reason, I guess to make the Will Smith character human, the screenwriter gave him a wife and a child. That was the rifle on the mantelpiece. We're waiting for the whole movie for this super secret government agency to just go after his wife and child. If they get the wife and child, they'll get him. They never did. And so millions of people walked out of the theater scratching their heads. Maybe they don't understand, maybe they didn't understand, maybe they weren't that hip to the nuances of commercial writing, but certainly they were dissatisfied. And that's my point. You cannot leave your audience hanging. Now, the movie made millions of dollars, and you can't argue with success, but I wonder how many more millions it would have made if it had been better worked out. And we see a lot of that. You know, all of us are very sophisticated much more sophisticated than we really think we are about storytelling, about writing. Why? Because we're saturated with stories from the time we're children. We may not understand when we feel cheated exactly what the dynamic is that's going on, or we may not understand how they could have fixed it. One of the curses, by the way, of being a professional writer is that it's almost impossible to enjoy anything completely because you're sitting there rewriting everything that you see. We call it punching it up, and you do it involuntarily. But there are a few where you don't, you know, that are just so damn good, and I'm going to address myself to some of those later today. Moving on to, briefly, I'll cover this in greater detail later, is you have to try to be a self-editor, and it's hard because when we write something, and we're not doing it every day of our lives, when we write something, it's very hard to look at it objectively. I'm sure you've all experienced this, and so you put it aside for a while, and 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then you read it, and you wince at what you've read. And one of the tricks in developing your talent is to keep that self-editor alive, and hopefully the more writing you do, the more simultaneous the ability to self-criticize becomes. But there are some fundamental questions. I call it it's almost like a computer in your head, a kind of a checklist that you set up for yourself, so that you can maintain this objectivity as you're doing it. One of the questions you need to ask is this particular thing that I'm writing, even though I may love it, is it really moving the story? Is it taking us to the next step? And you have to be cold-blooded about how you approach these things. One of the major problems, I think, for writers who are not experienced is that all of us, there's a story we want to tell, and we can envision 2 or 3 scenes that they're so vivid to us we can almost taste them, and we want to get that down. So you do, and then you look at it and say, where does it go from here? I'll address that in more detail later. The problem of, again, asking yourself, is what I'm writing too obvious? Is this scene or character or line of dialogue really necessary? You got to be cold-blooded about it. You got to look at it as if you're the reader. Am I going to be holding the reader's attention, the viewer's attention? Am I repeating myself? I am waiting for a program. They've got wonderful spell checkers now and grammar checkers and everything. And the one I'm waiting for is the tombstoning program. In television, when a writer repeats the same word or phrase several times within a few pages, we call it tombstoning. And we call them on it and say, just change it. But we do it unconsciously as we're writing, and so it would be wonderful to have an addition to our word processing programs where it would tell us, boop, 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 you've said impossible, 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 that kind of thing, just to call it to your attention. Meanwhile, until that happens, you have to look at it that way yourself. Is there enough energy in my story? Is there, I will talk about things like heat, energy, conflict as we go along. Energy is such a major factor, and particularly, by the way, in comedy. something that unfortunately a lot of the current comedy writers and directors don't understand. If you want to study how comedy should be done, for those of you who are interested in that kind of thing, and energy is necessary in anything, heavy drama as well. There are a couple of old movies that you should check out. One is a movie called His Girl Friday, which is arguably the funniest movie ever made. It had Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell in it, and it moves a mile a minute, non-stop, and it's sheer energy, and it's great fun. The other example is almost any film by Frank Capra. Frank Capra, I learned more about directing from Frank Capra's book, The Name Above the Title, than I did from studying with Lee Strasberg, which I did. Frank Capra, I'll give you a little anecdote about how energy worked for him in an odd way in movies. He was one of the star directors for Columbia Pictures, which was run by a legendary nutcase named Harry Cohn. And Harry Cohn came through the studio one day and issued an edict that none of the directors, to save money, none of the directors could print more than one take of any scene. And the directors had been profligate and were printing, 5, 6, 7 takes of one scene. So that was the rule. So Frank Capra took that and turned it to his advantage. He would slate a scene, the actors would run the scene, and instead of saying cut, he'd say, okay, everybody back to position 1 and do it faster. and what happened was the hairdressers didn't get a chance to come in and straighten them up. The actors went back and they did it with more energy. And then when they'd done it the second time, he'd say, okay, now run it again, only faster. And by the time he was through, he had 3 or 4 takes of the same scene on one slate. And in the end result was just incredible energy to his movies. This is the guy who did Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, among others, Meet John Doe, one of my favorites. And you can learn a lot from these films, and some of today's filmmakers could learn a lot from them too. Everybody asks me, not everybody, but a lot of people ask me, where do you get your ideas? In television, naturally, you have to come up with a lot of them. Well, I steal them. And I suggest you do the same. There are no new stories. They were all used up before Shakespeare ever started. Anybody who thinks they're going to come up with an original story is really, smoking the wrong kind of flowers. And that's not to say you shouldn't try to be original. Originality comes from putting these stories through our own filters, how we view the world. And they come out original. I'll give you a quick example of how it worked for me in television. When I started writing for Murder, She Wrote, before it went on the air, the guy who had created the show, Peter Fisher, told me, and I was unfamiliar with writing mysteries, but he told me not to worry because he'd hold my hand. And I said, what kind of shows do you intend for them to be? And he said, well, sort of Agatha Christie, locked room mysteries. Now, that means to me that device where at the end of the show, the detective gets all of the suspects lined up in the drawing room and says, you might have done it. You had the motive and the means and the time, but you didn't do it. And then he goes from one to the other. I said to Peter, when I was a kid, I read a couple of Agatha Christie's and a couple of locker room mysteries, and they bored the hell out of me, and I'm not going to write that for you. And he said, well, what will you write? And I said, I'll write The Maltese Falcon. And he said, that'll be fine. And that's what I did for 12 years. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with The Maltese Falcon, I'll digress for a moment. The Maltese Falcon is written by Dashiell Hammett, and it is the seminal modern detective story. Nobody has topped it. The only man who has come close was the Raymond Chandler novels by about Philip Marlowe. I know this is arguable and opinionated, but I believe it's true, and I believe that ever since 1928, when Hammett wrote The Maltese Falcon, that mystery writers have been trying to imitate him and top him, and nobody's done it. And also a little sidebar about that novel and about the movie with Humphrey Bogart and Peter Lorre and Sidney Greenstreet. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this story, and even for those of you who are, it might be interesting. It was to be John Huston's first directing job. He had been a writer before, and John Huston was a sort of a legendary profligate in Hollywood. He drank a lot, caroused a lot, put off work a lot, and avoided work a lot. And he had continued to stall Jack Warner on the delivery of the script for The Maltese Falcon. And finally, on a Friday afternoon in 1939 or 40, Jack Warner, who ran the studio and owned it, it was his fiefdom, called Huston at his office and said, no more excuses, I want the script on my desk Monday morning. And Huston had not written a word. So he tossed the book on his secretary's desk at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and said, turn it into script form. And that was the script they shot. It's almost word for word the book. One of the only changes is the last line in the movie when Sergeant Polhouse is alone in Spade's apartment with this is about Sam Spade, and Sam Spade is holding the Maltese Falcon, and Tom Polhouse says, what's it made of? And Sam, and he says, the stuff of dreams. that was about Huston's only original contribution to the Maltese Falcon, but he did a superb job of directing it, and it's a timeless movie. There is one of my favorite quotes. We should etch it on our brains. Is a line of Alfred Hitchcock's. Those of you who, I guess everybody must know who Alfred Hitchcock was. He was a great film director. And he said, quote, drama is real life with the dull parts left out, unquote. Now, think about that. This includes, this includes writing factual material, writing biographies. You need to find the drama. You need to find the heat. You need to find the problems that the people are having. Look at any, even the worst television sitcoms. They're all about conflict and problems and people trying to get from A to B and not being able to. Whether it's a kid struggling to climb up on the counter and steal a cookie from the cookie jar, that's already conflict and drama. That's the stuff you gotta play. Again, I'll expand on some of that later. I'm not crazy about slogans, but I do, for the purpose of these talks, try to reduce this to what I call the 3 C's: conflict, characterization, and construction. These are the things that are necessary to make stories work. I have a theory, by the way, that probably a half of the desk drawers in America have unfinished manuscripts in them that were started by people who, really wanted to tell a story. And after they wrote those few scenes that they could almost taste, they were stuck. Well, we're going to address that in some detail from here on out. And I'm going to start by talking about outlining. Everybody hates outlining, but it's vital if you want to finish the book you're writing, or the screenplay you're writing, or the story you're telling, or the short story, or even the simplest things. What is it about? It's about maintaining your overview of the thing. It's about maintaining your control over that which you're writing, so that it doesn't get away from you, so that you don't get to that hopeless position where you figure it's not going to work. Now, let me tell you that never goes away. All the television writing I've ever done, I tell you flat out that at some point in every script I ever wrote, I got to a point, I call it, there's a literary term called the slough of the spond. I forget, it's from some famous. It's a point at which I put my hands down and I say, I don't think I can pull this one off. Now, I had plenty of proof that I could pull them off because I've been getting paid for it for a long time. It happens to, the point I'm making is it happens to everyone. So don't feel that it's just you. But usually I've found that when I get to that point where it's got me baffled, the next day I figure it out. It just seems to work that way. I don't know why. Maybe it's, I don't know that applies to everyone, but it's worked that way for me. Point about outlining again, and I'm going to beat you up about this because, again, this is how we did it in television. You start out with a one-line description of what the show is going to be. Now, why is a one-line description or a two-line? Obviously, you can't do a novel in one line. It might take 3 or 4 or 5 lines, or a movie might take that. But for a television episode, one line usually suffices. And if you know what that one line is, that's your focus. You know that that's the story you're telling. And it begins to suggest how the rest of the story goes. I'll get back to that in some detail. I'll talk about it this afternoon in pitching, but for those of you who are not going to be hanging around for the afternoon session, let me say that we pitch television stories in the following manner. We'll say, this is a pitch from a couple of young women writers came into me when I was running Murder, She Wrote. They had never written a television script before, never sold one before. And so they sat down and they're nervous, but they pitched it right. The pitch was, a vampire comes to Cabot Cove. Now, some of you are nodding because you can already begin to write the story. You're writing it in your heads. That's, by the way, a good pitch when your audience begins to fill in the blanks for you. But I could immediately see what this, the way the story would go. It's a great hook. Okay. Now you go from there to a page or a long paragraph, and this is, you should do this for yourselves when you've got a story you want to tell, because by expanding it gradually in these increments, you will be able to maintain a sense of what it's about, so you don't get to that awful place where it's overwhelming you, where you're lost because you've gotten bogged in the details of one or more scenes, and the character, you don't know where the character, you don't know who the characters are, you don't know what they do, that kind of thing. So this is really a way to think about writing, to approach writing. Now, I can tell you how much this is regarded. The outlining stage is where you do your hardest work. And in television and movies, the Writers Guild has worked out the payment schedule. The story, that is the outline, is worth 40% of the full price. And usually the deals in television are that they can cut you, and movies, is they can cut you off at story. It's called story with option for teleplay or option for screenplay. And basically what that lets the buyer do is bail out if clearly by the time you finish writing your story outline, you don't know where you're going or it isn't working. But it also tells you how you know, in a dollar sense of how much value is placed on the work that goes into the story outline. Now, in television, again, and this is not a bad way to approach it. We start out with the pitch, the one-line pitch. Go from there to a page or more. That gets okayed by the network. You then go to what they call steps. Now, steps are, for a dramatic show, for an hour series, we roughly, I mean, we literally would take a legal pad and divide it up into 4 sections, a single page, because the television structure is 4 acts. And you've got 8 scenes per act. Now, again, it's flexible, but that's the sort of bare bones of it. And you've got to have a dramatic moment at the act break, what we call the act out. Well, obviously that's peculiar to television, but I'll get into the 3-act structure later on in some detail. In fact, you know, really address it now. For those of you who don't know, probably many of you do, the 3-act structure is simply this. In the first act, you put your protagonist up in a tree. In the second act, you throw stones at him, and in the third act, you get him down out of the tree. That's it. It's worked for centuries and centuries and centuries, and don't let anybody tell you that the 3-act structure is dead, because it ain't. Again, it's about giving your audience satisfaction. That's not to say we don't want to surprise them, that we don't want to throw them some curves, but the truth is that's the way to construct your show. Your book, your novel, I will refer to it as a show, but you know, it's, and when you're doing these steps, and when I say steps, by the way, I'm talking about, you start out with maybe 3 or 4 lines per scene, just describing what takes place in the scene. Now, there's more to describing it than saying, well, she walks into the room and he says. It's about what is the meat of the scene. Where's the conflict? Where is the advancement of the story in the scene? What am I accomplishing in this scene? By the way, I'll give you a wonderful exercise so that will take all the mystery out of what an outline should look like. You probably all have VCRs, and you probably all have a favorite movie. Rent, or if you have a copy of it, run your favorite movie and stop the tape after each scene and write a 3 or 4 line description of what the scene was about. It'll take you several hours. It might take you a couple of days. When you're through, you'll have an outline. And you'll look at it and it will amaze you. Because that's what it is. That's what we all have to do to make our stories work. But you'll learn a lot about structure and storytelling from that exercise. I've used it to steal movies for television. Excuse me.
Do you always know where you're going?
No. Which I realize flies in the face of everything I'm saying, but I'll get to that. I try to know where I'm going. Obviously, if you're doing a Murder, She Wrote episode, you have a pretty good idea. But even there, since I was always aware that I was playing a game with a fairly hip audience, the regular audience who was watching the show and was always trying to outguess me about who the killer was, I would often write it, I wouldn't sometimes clear into the script itself. Well, no, usually it was a story outline, but
sometimes I change it. I wouldn't decide who the killer was until I was well into the third act. And then if I needed to plant what we call the Playfair clues so that the audience could, if they were paying sharp enough attention, figure it out, I'd go back into the story and plant those things. But I was always, it was that game. So that's one aspect of not knowing where you're going. The other is, I've got a novel that just came out, which I'm going to try and sell you later, that I spent 2.5 years writing, and I thought I knew where it was going, but what happens, and I'm sure you've heard about this phenomenon, is, are you chilly, by the way? Would you like more heat in here? Is it okay? Oh, okay. Is everybody comfortable? Yeah, okay. Is that my characters began to tell me where the story was going to go. I had a pretty good idea of the plot and so on, and this was going to happen and that was going to happen, but by God, especially in a novel where you get a chance to develop the characters beyond 1 or 2 dimensions, they begin to talk to you. And when you that's one of the great, that's one of the highs from writing, is when you get there, you're cooking. There is, by the way, a classic story. Ray Walston, the Broadway actor, just died. There was a wonderful legend in Hollywood that when he was starring in my favorite Martian, they handed him the script for next week's episode, and he was reading the sides, and he got to one place, he said, "A Martian wouldn't say that." So your characters will sometimes tell you how to write their story. They will literally say to you, "I wouldn't do that. I'm going to play you an excerpt from something that I wrote that goes to that, but I won't do it right now. That goes to how even, and this was a historical piece. This was a fact piece, but I found that writing it, the characters were almost like fictional characters because you had to invent so much, and it had to be true to what they were. You also, when you're doing your outlining, finally, it allows you to see how your pacing is working. You can't have explosions in every scene. It's all, you can almost chart it. You need to vary the pace and the energy. You need, there are those quiet moments followed by the explosion or the gunshot or whatever. But those techniques and that aspect of pacing, it's much easier to see it and to have to maintain that overview when you are outlining it. Then you can see what the whole of it is, what we call the gestalt of it. There are devices. How many of you have tried writing things when you discover you've got characters that are dangling where they just don't have enough to do, they don't have enough business? Now, in television, where we supervise the development of scripts very carefully from the pitch through 2 drafts of the outline and then 2 drafts of the script, we try to catch all that stuff. And one of the frequent ways we deal with a character who seems superfluous, I mean, part of it's budget. We're paying for that actor. He or she better damn well be earning her money. So we try to, sometimes we'll combine a character. We'll say, well, this, maybe this character and this character are the same character. Try that. I think that can work. Or another way to look at it is putting all your characters to work. Finding lines of conflict for them. That's really the essence of it. And I'm going to get into conflict and creating characters soon. You got two brothers. Now, why you've got two brothers, I don't know, but you got two brothers in the story. And one of them's doing one thing and the other's doing the other, but there's no heat between them. Well, what kind of baggage is there between brothers? You know, you've all got siblings, most of you. What kind of stuff was going on? That's the stuff of drama. That's the stuff of theater. In movies and television and in novels, you can do parallel action. I'm talking now about devices. Parallel action is, meanwhile, traditionally in television and what we call the run and jump shows, the action adventure shows, we call them "what are the bad guys doing" scenes. In fact, Stephen Cannell, who I believe is from this area, right, used to have a sign over his computer on the wall and said, "What are the bad guys doing?" And cut from your hero to the bad guys. Oh, and that's another thing, writing to the money. You've got a protagonist in your story. Well, you can pretty well use a rule of thumb that we use in television, which is called writing to the money. I'll use Murder, She Wrote as an example. Angela Lansbury was the star. She was never absent from more than one consecutive scene. In other words, we did not do two consecutive scenes in which she did not appear. Keep your hero or your heroine alive. Keep them active in your story. Clocks are other devices that will liven up your story. It's the time limit. The money has to be delivered by a certain time. The delivery has to be made. The payment on the mortgage has to be made, or they'll foreclose. You know, that kind of thing. MacGuffins are another device. How many of you, just out of curiosity, know what a MacGuffin is? Bless you. The MacGuffin is the device or the object that everybody wants. Traditionally, it's the secret plans. In the Maltese Falcon, it was the Maltese Falcon. In that Will Smith movie that I mentioned, it was a computer disk. It's in almost all of the Hitchcock movies, there was a MacGuffin, and an innocent person had the MacGuffin in his or her possession and didn't realize it, and the bad guys wanted it and would do anything to get it. That's a MacGuffin. Platforming is another thing that's terribly important to remember. And I alluded to it a little while ago that once I decided who the killer was going to be in a Murder, She Wrote episode, I would then go back and platform certain things. I would establish certain things about a character or about an event that was going to happen later on in the show. It's a shorthand for establishing, but we again call it platforming. The penny drop. Penny drop is peculiar to, I never heard it before or since Murder, She Wrote, but the penny drop was the moment when Jessica Fletcher said, and it was usually it was towards the end of the third act, or the beginning of the fourth act, she would say, "Wait a minute, we've been following, we've had it all wrong. Now I think I know who did it." And then the fourth act was her building to what we call the gotcha scene, where she would trick the murderer into confessing. So that the penny drop is when the hero or heroine realizes what's really going on. And it's a good device, you know. It can be used in a number of ways. Coincidence should be used sparingly, but coincidence happens in real life, and again, in a typical television episode, we would allow ourselves one coincidence per episode. If you see a lot of coincidences, it usually means it's badly written. And the Deus Ex Machina is really that I believe the literal translation is God in the machine. And the Deus Ex Machina can be, I mean, I usually think of it as an outside force that changes everything. It could be the typhoon that suddenly comes up and blows everything away. The wind that blows the gold dust back to the mountains at the end of Treasure of the Sierra Madre is in effect a Deus Ex Machina. And it should be used sparingly. I tend to prefer to have, as a rule, and this is one you should write on your foreheads, that your hero or heroine should be the engine of his or her own salvation. What I mean by that is that you shouldn't dump the solution to their problem into their laps. Make them work for it. It's unsatisfying to us if, I'll give you an example in simple. For those of you who remember a wonderful detective series on television, The Rockford Files. The structure of The Rockford Files was very simple. Jim Garner would take a case and he would knock on 3 or 4 doors during the course of the show to get information. And invariably, it was always a variation on, let me put it that way, it was always a variation on the person whose door he was knocking on didn't want to give him the answer, didn't want to talk to him. It was conflict. It was, in other words, he had to earn everything that he did. If you see a procedural, where a police procedural, where people are voluntarily giving up information to the detectives or the people who are making the inquiry, it's pretty dull if they just answer the questions. Now, obviously, you can't beat that one to death. But even if you watch Law and Order, which is a really superbly written show, most of the time there's an edge between the detectives and the person they're questioning. If there isn't an edge, if they're not reluctant to answer the questions, or they're misleading or lying, there's usually some kind of edge in the scene. Without it, it's pretty dull. Now I'll move on to, oh, you know what? We'll take a little break, and because I see that we're almost to an hour. So let's take 5 minutes. I'd like to do a little pitch for myself though before you break. Behind you in that boardroom is a display of my book Plots Unlimited, which is a book based on a software program that I created, which is basically several thousand plot segments that are linked to one another. And it's a very useful reference tool for getting your engine started. The other thing I have is a display of the cover of my novel, The 16th Man, a thriller. The books were shipped by ground rather than air, so I don't have any books. But if you'd like to sign up for an autographed copy, there's a yellow pad. Write down your name, address, and all the vital statistics, and what you'd like me to write in the inscription, and I will do so. And it tells you in there who to make the check out to, Ashley Wilde Incorporated. The novel is $16.95, and the book, Plots Unlimited, which normally sells for $25, you can have for $20. And I will autograph those later after the session breaks. So anyway, take a break, and we'll be back in 5 or 6 minutes. Get started. Speaking, it should have this dynamic, a beginning, middle, and an end, and it should go someplace. Where to start a scene and where to end it, and why the playwright's curse is the novelist and screenwriter's blessing. Let me start with that part of it. The nice thing about writing for movies is that you don't have to write entrances and exits. If you're a playwright, you're stuck with it because you got to bring people on and off the stage. But unless an entrance is very interesting or entertaining or dramatic, a la Kramer's entrances and exits on Seinfeld, I generally try to avoid it. I mean, so somebody comes in a door. Well, if we start the scene after they've come in the door, we pretty much know if it's not their office or their apartment that they came through the door. So unless the act of coming through the door is really entertaining, forget it. Where to start a scene. William Goldman, the great screenwriter, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Bridge Too Far, etc., 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 Marathon Man, says it better than anybody. He says, get into a scene as late as you can. Now, when I started writing, I didn't know where to begin scenes. I would write all of the dialogue sides and all of the action. It's a telephone. They got to get up pretty early in the morning to. They got to get up damned early in the morning to fool me. I thought maybe I had forgotten to turn on my cell phone. I'm glad it wasn't mine. Anyway, goodbye. Anyway, at the beginning, I used to write the whole thing, and then I would start cutting and cutting and cut off the beginning, because you discover that you don't really need that stuff at the beginning. You can, the audience will catch up with you pretty damn quickly. You need to have, your scene should have a button. We call them buttons in television. It's the punchline. It's the moment when the scene is supposed to end. And you can usually tell if you're stepping on your own buttons, and you shouldn't. In other words, know that this is the place that you get out of the scene. I'm frequently in television, and I use it a lot in my novel, was we go out of a scene on a reaction. Go out of the scene on one of the characters pondering what was just said or done. Well, that's not a bad way to think about it, even if you're writing narrative. And we directed our scripts on the page to that extent in television. In movies, there is a conceit that the directors are offended if you put too much stage direction in there, and it's true. But there are certain instances where you want to make a point, and you want to make sure that the director gets it. And so write it. I mean, if the director is offended, to hell with him. It's. I mean, you're the writer. They can always change it, and sometimes they do. Fortunately, in television, which is a writer's medium, they don't. But they don't. They sometimes would like to. The dreaded non-scene. The non-scene is the scene where you say, what was this scene about? What did it accomplish? Where was the conflict? If it's just the classic non-scene for me, and God knows even seasoned professionals would occasionally do it. And part of my job, by the way, in writing for television and producing was to be an editor, to guide these scripts, not just my own, but other people's, through the process and make sure that it was consistent with the show that I was producing and so on. And so you have to learn in that job to quickly recognize problems and quickly be able to tell people how to fix them. And the non-scene is usually, I'll describe it so you'll understand what I'm talking about. The non-scene is that scene where you feel like you've got to get it in there because it's information. I've got to figure out how to get this character from there to there. So I'm going to have them do an explanation or something. And that's all that's happening in the scene. You're doing it wrong. Yes, you have to get certain information across and all of that, but you got, this is distracting, excuse me. Can I unplug this?
Sure.
How's that? You've got to get these, certain of this boilerplate across to your reader, but do it in the context of something happening in the scene besides just that. Otherwise, your audience's eyes will glaze over. They'll either put your book down or click to the next channel or stop paying attention. The toughest scenes to write, I find, are love scenes. Romantic scenes, because it's two people who basically agree with each other. And therefore, it doesn't usually inherently have a lot of edge to it or conflict. So you got to find it. And my favorite example of this kind of scene is and how to do it right is the opening scene from a Preston Sturges movie called Christmas in July, in which he's got two lovers on the roof of this apartment building in Manhattan at night, and they're obviously in love with each other, but it's an argument. We write arguments. Remember that you write arguments. People agreeing with each other is dull. Find the edges. Find those differing goals. They don't have to be, when I talk about edges and I talk about heat and talk about conflict, it doesn't have to be in-your-face conflict. It doesn't have to be, people screaming and yelling at each other. Sometimes you write that. It can be as simple as I did an improv years ago in a directing workshop in which the whole setup, and I whispered the motivations to the two actors, the whole setup was a young woman was being interviewed for a job, and she's sitting across the table from the guy who's interviewing her. And the guy who's interviewing her has a package of cigarettes on his desk. And I whispered to the girl, because there was no inherent conflict in the scene, it was a job interview. So I whispered to the actress who was doing being the interviewee, I said, "You're dying for a cigarette, and you don't have any of your own. And I want you to try to let that guy know by your body language." It would be obviously improper to bum a cigarette from the guy. So try to let him know by your body language without being too obvious that he should offer you a cigarette. And it brought this whole otherwise prosaic scene to life. Well, that conflicts can be that small. But you got to think conflict. Where's the heat? Where is the edge? Believe me, there is no substitute for it. Again, questioning your own work. I alluded to it earlier. Do you have enough story? Are your scenes in the best order possible? Is this scene necessary? I'll give you an example of a movie. I don't know about you guys. There are certain old movies that I love, and when I revisit them, I do it with increasing unease over the years, because I don't want to be disappointed by the ones that I remember fondly. And Sometimes we are, sometimes we aren't. Casablanca never lets me down. The Maltese Falcon never lets me down. His Girl Friday, things like that. The other night, I saw a movie that I absolutely adored when it first came out. It's called The Professionals. And it was written and directed by Richard Brooks, and it had Lee Marvin and Burt Lancaster and Woody Strode and Robert Ryan, and it was a terrific movie. And it was terrific still, except that it didn't have enough story. In 1967 or whatever it was when it came out, it blew me away. If you watched it now, you'd see, yeah, it's entertaining, but there's not enough going on between the characters. And so it's a lesson. This is about lessons. This is about learning from the stuff you see out there. Again, asking yourself the hard questions about whether your scenes, what do I accomplish in a scene, is a very cold-blooded but practical question to ask. What does it do in moving the story? What information am I passing along to the audience? And what new things am I introducing? Is it surprising them? Is it too predictable? That kind of thing. Do your characters have goals, needs, attitudes, and points of view? If they don't, you damn well better give them goals, needs, attitudes, and points of view. That's what stories are made of. That's what conflict and drama and comedy are made of. By the way, for those of you, if you haven't thought about it, all comedy is about conflict. You know, think about any sitcom that you see, any comedy movie that you see. It's about conflict. It's about people trying to get from A to B and being unable to get there, or being frustrated, or there's somebody in the show who doesn't want them to get there. Plot conveniences. Plot conveniences are dumping things in your protagonist's lap, or conveniently having the storm come along. Beware of them. Now we go to your first act, getting your story up and running. You need to grab your audience and hang on to them. You need to hook them. Don't be too slow about getting into your story. Start in the middle of the story, and if you need to explain something about why they are in this, your characters are in this situation, back up later on and explain it. Don't begin too early in the story. You know, all of the characters that you're writing about had lives before page 1. And some of them, the ones that you don't kill off, are going to have lives after the last page. So you need to think about that, and it helps in terms of creating your characters, which I'll get into later, this business of thinking about their baggage, thinking about, you know, what they're bringing to the table. You know, they're not just Joe and Sal, and you've planted them in this scene. They've had whole lives. The what is it, briefly, is it's okay to throw your audience off balance so that they don't know what they're looking at. Guys who do commercials are very adept at that, the people who create television commercials, where suddenly, you know, you're looking at this thing and you don't know what it is. But you get there, and you get there in 30 seconds or 20 seconds. Well, it's okay to do that in a story, and it's often a very good device in terms of holding your audience. If you've got them wondering what it is they're reading about, that's terrific. The downside, have any of you seen Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon yet? I guess it hasn't gotten up here. It's a movie, it's a Chinese movie that the critics are all talking about as the best foreign film in decades, and it's, you know, this, and so on the basis of this, I watched it, and it was about 2 hours and 20 minutes long. It was 2 hours too long of that time, And at the end of the movie, I had no idea what it was about. So that's carrying the what is it to an extreme. Second and third acts, rising action and or drama, dialing up the heat, raising the stakes. I will get into things like stakes later on, that it is terribly important for your characters to have something at stake that they care about. Because if they don't care about it, your audience isn't going to care about it. They have these needs. When you get to endings, you should surprise them. You should give them something that they don't quite expect. I didn't, at the end of my novel, I didn't come up with the ending until I was all finished with the book. And with a different ending. And then suddenly at 4 o'clock in the morning, I saw how to end it. And it happened, you know, but it's a surprise ending. The other is you've got to give your audiences satisfaction. And classically, I mentioned it to somebody here, the old setup from the old classic Westerns, there was a rule called the obligatory scene. And basically, the structure of all the old Westerns was that at the top of the show, at the beginning of the story, the bad guy did something terrible to the hero, either personally or, you know, killed his family or, well, you know, whatever. By the end of the movie, at the end of the movie, you had to play, either if not the last scene, very close to it, what we call the obligatory scene in which they face each other down in the street of the dusty western town. That's satisfaction. If you didn't get to that, if you didn't give your audience that, they'd be pissed off at you. I mean, that's, you know, that's the bottom line. Know when it's over. Get to your punchline and don't step on it. Get out of your scenes and get out of your story before. You know, any of you ever see a movie called Beaches? It had 4 endings. It would end. It was a really nice movie, by the way. I'm not knocking it, except that it ended, and you figured, okay, now the credits are going to roll, and we'll go to another scene. And that would be an ending, and then it would go to another scene, and it was a little bit bizarre. Most of the time, people know when they've gotten to their endings. Recommended plotters, I've got them down here besides Shakespeare and Dostoevsky, Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, Irwin Shaw, The Young Lions, and his short stories. By the way, Irwin Shaw has written a couple of the greatest short stories in American literature. One of them is called Girls in Their Summer Dresses, and the other is called The 80-Yard Run. And The 80-Yard Run is probably the most piercingly American story maybe that's ever been written. It's about a guy who goes back to his college, I believe it's his college reunion, and he goes out to the football field where he had made the 80-yard run in college and realizes that that was the high point of his life, that it was all downhill from then, which, you know, is, as I say, a peculiarly American story. John O'Hara, I consider the best American writer of the last century. I know I can get a lot of arguments, but I love arguments anyway. John O'Hara, his first novel, Appointment at Samara, is the most perfect novel I have ever read in my life, and I really recommend it to all of you because there isn't a wasted syllable in the book. He was also, by the way, and I talk about it later, maybe the best dialogue writer around. Robert Towne, who wrote Chinatown, one of the great screenplays ever done, and Bill Goldman, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. If we have time later, I'm going to play some tapes of some curtain scenes from various movies, but we don't have time now because I want to move on to creating characters and writing dialogue.
What about Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain?
That's not bad either. Huckleberry Finn is even better. The great American novel. Okay. Again, going back to the author's mindset in creating characters. In television, when we try to create a pilot concept for a series, it's almost a recipe of the goal, by the way, when you create a television series, is that it should run for 7 years or 8 years. You get enough shows in the can that you can sell it into syndication and they can make money on the back end, because they'll never admit that they made money the first time around, and they probably won't admit it even after it becomes a hit in syndication, but that's another story. Anyway, so the standard recipe for the core characters in a television series, be it drama or comedy, is that they all are in conflict with each other, and the conflicts are of a nature that will sustain them for 7 years, that won't go away, won't get resolved, but won't be severe enough to blow them apart. So they'll still be, friends will still be friends after 7 years. The Seinfeld people will still be friends after 7 or 9 years or whatever it is. But there's always an edge between them, and if you look at any successful television series, you will see that dynamic. Well, that's a good lesson to learn for whatever it is you're writing. Again, a novel, a short story, a screenplay. What kind of conflict any kind can do. It can be tiny. It can be all the way from hatred to just mild dislike, to revenge, jealousy, deception, any of these things. By the way, they're all in Plots Unlimited, all of those conflicts, because the whole thing is based on conflict. They need to have goals. Some of their goals should be small. Some of them can be very immediate. A woman trying to get her dress out of the dry cleaners because she's got to go to a party that night and she's frustrated by it. That's already a conflict. A kid trying to get to the cookie jar without his mother seeing him, and he knocks the cookie jar over and breaks it. Or, well, it goes on and on and on, but you need to think in those terms. Don't make your conflicts or your goals among your different characters too similar, unless it serves your story. You need to have arcs for your characters. In other words, an arc is your character is at point A at the top of your show, and by the end of the story, he or she is at point B or C. There are very few writers and filmmakers who can get away with the opposite. Woody Allen is the only one I know, and Woody Allen is a certified genius and a great artist, and he's the only one I know who can get away with having his characters be just as big schmucks at the end as they were at the beginning, a la the movie Manhattan. But he did it in a way that, he broke the rules in that sense, but it works, and it's arguably a masterpiece. But for most of us, your characters need to take a trip, a journey, and they have to be in a different place at the end. Where are they coming? Where were they coming from before the first page? Where are they going? Try to catch your characters, particularly your major characters, at a crisis point in their lives, at a place where it could go either way. Maybe they've spent years in a career that they're not satisfied with, and they've just blown it, or they're wrestling with the idea of it. Or something terrible has just happened, a death in the family, something that creates emotional problems. That's heat. That's being a dramatist. It's theater. It's keeping your audience involved. It's keeping them caring. Try to avoid cliches. We all know what a cliche is. We've seen cliche characters. The old tightwad. These stereotypes. Try to stand them on their ears. Try to give us something fresh, a fresh take on that kind of thing from people we know. The expanding bio, when you start writing your little bios of your characters before you even get into your outline, and you should, let it expand, because as you learn, as you get into your story, as you get further into your outline and then into actually writing your screenplay or your novel or your story, you're going to learn more about these characters. Add it to the bio that you write. I mean, mine will start out at sometimes 3, 4, 5 lines at the most, and by the time I'm through, like with the novel, a single character's bio would go on for more than a page, double-spaced. Because I knew more about him, and I could use it, and I needed to put down those things I knew about the character to remind me to use it later on. Giving them goals and motivation, what do they need, what do they want, and who or what is in their way. Your characters have to want something, they have to need something, they have to be trying to get from point A to point B. A character who is static, a character who is just there in your story to fill a dramatic need for, say, to give your other character somebody to talk to, don't stop there. Find an edge for that character. Find a problem for that character. It doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to conflict with your major theme or your major conflict in your story. But that's what brings your characters to life. That's the difference between a writer and a non-writer. It's a way to think. That's really what I'm trying to give you here, a sort of a shorthand. Give them color. Give them conditions that make them human. Give one of them a sinus problem or an allergy, or you can be funny about it. You can give one of them you can have in a wheelchair, or one of them has always been bothered by the fact that he or she is too short. These are human problems that your readers and your viewers can identify with. Identification, by the way, is a term that doesn't get used much anymore, but it's terribly important. Being able to connect with the characters that you read about or see in a movie. That's what makes this stuff work for your audience, and for you, too. Hang-ups and psychoses, from Scarlett O'Hara to Eddie Felsen to Julian English to Tony Soprano. Think about, Scarlett O'Hara was this totally self-involved, she was the heroine of Gone with the Wind. She was really a terrible human being. She was right up there with all the characters on Seinfeld. They are a modern incarnation of Scarlett O'Hara, all of them. They were totally self-involved people. They were never talking to each other, they were talking at each other. And in Scarlett O'Hara's case, despite all of that, she was attractive. We loved her. Why? Because there's a part of Scarlett O'Hara in all of us. I'll do it tomorrow. Tomorrow's another day. She was so human. Eddie Felsen was the pool player in The Hustler, played by Paul Newman. And Eddie Felsen was a guy who couldn't stand to win. The difference between a winner and a loser is that the winner, 51% of them wants to win and only 49% wants to lose. That's going on in all of us. It's going on in Bill Gates. Maybe with Bill Gates, it's only 22% that wants to lose. But the point is, there's a part of Bill Gates, like all of us, who wants to lose. We either feel that we're, I mean, in Eddie Felson's case, as in Richard Nixon's case, they did not feel worthy of their success. There was a psychological history of Richard Nixon that was written after he left office by a psychiatrist who posited he wrote, it was a matter of record, that when Richard Nixon was a little boy, he would accomplish good things in school to get his mother's love. And then he got it, and then he'd wet the bed because he didn't really feel he deserved it. And that's what brought him down in the presidency. Well, that's a totally human story. You know, we should not hate him for that. We can hate him for other things, but we don't have to hate him for that. He was one of us, you know? And that humanity, to try to bring that to your characters, is what being a writer and being a dramatist is all about. And even if you're writing about real people, that's the hardest part, by the way. Writing fact, writing true stories, which I'm sure some of you want to tell about relatives, yourselves, friends. It's the hardest thing to write because it's so hard to leave the dull parts out. But you gotta do it. You gotta find the drama. I will address that in a few minutes in terms of a piece that I wrote about a real human being. The kind of hang-ups you can give your people: obsessive compulsive, passive aggressive. You can make them paranoid, compulsive, they fear success, or they have a fatal flaw. John O'Hara wrote characters over and over again. Julian English was his hero in Appointment in Samara, and Julian English had a fatal flaw, which I won't tell you about, but it was a doozy. Exposition. You've written all this information about your character. You know all about the character. Don't feel that you got to tell your reader or your audience about it in the first scene. Dole it out. We call it in television peeling the onion. It's much better to tantalize your audience with one little, maybe anomalous aspect of a character. Why is this character lying? Why is this character doing X? Than to explain the whole thing right at the top. Sometimes you don't have to explain all of it ever, but you know it, and it goes into the creation of this character. Don't front load your exposition. Tease your audience with the what is it or the who is it. The toughest scenes, the scenes that baffle me the most and I find the toughest to write are the scenes where I introduce a character. And it should be hard for you too, if you're doing it right. And the reason is that first meeting between your character and your audience is so critical, because you're imprinting certain things about that character to your audience, and it's an impression that's going to stick with the audience all through the novel or the show. And so you want it to be very particular. And I can't tell you, the details because we don't have an example here, but it is the most critical thing. So you need to choose the right setup, the right situation, and the precise moment at which you introduce that character. What is that character doing the first time we see him or her? Is he stealing money? Why is he stealing money? You don't have to explain it. You don't have to explain that he's breaking into a safe. You don't have to explain right away why this woman is throwing things across the room and breaking furniture. It's a hell of a way to start, though. It makes her, aren't we interested in her from the moment we see her? Why is she doing this? Why is she so pissed off? What's going on? Again, motivating your plot by the conflict in your character mix, by building it in, that will move your story. Those conflicts that you, even though your story may be about something entirely different, that those conflicts you build into your characters, how they interact with each other, will give you story points, will give you scenes, will give you material, so that you won't have the non-scenes. You will always be able to find that edge between them. You really, it is a mindset where you put two characters together in a scene that maybe haven't even had contact before in the show, and it's just an informational scene. Find the edge between them. Pass the information to your audience while you're playing out this conflict. Who wants what from whom? Who wants to prevent whom from what? Writing to the money I talked about, making your protagonist earn their money. In other words, if it's a detective show, have your detective figure it out. And that brings me, by the way, to a really interesting point, which is antagonists, bad guys, be they female or male. The smarter you make your bad guys, the more formidable you make your bad guys, the better your hero has to be in order to overcome those people. So they need to be not only smart, but attractive and fascinating. And one of the first lessons I learned when I went to New York as a kid and started drawing comic books was from a crusty comic book editor who took the cigar out of his mouth and said, "Kid, even your bad guys got to be attractive." Well, it's true. Think about some of the great bad guys in the movies. Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. We were fascinated by him. He did terrible things. He ate people's faces, but we couldn't take our eyes off him. Part of it was because of a superb acting performance. But World War II, a quick example. I was once pitching a pilot to CBS, about a World War II pilot, and it was to take place at a forward field hospital in Normandy in 1944. And there was a static German front in a little French town and the whole thing. Anyway, you know what it was. And so the guy at CBS listened to my pitch, and at the end of it he said, "Gee, I really like it, but you know, we're doing 2 World War II things already, so I think we're going to pass." And I don't know what made me say it, but I said to him, "Would you mind telling me what the things are that you're doing?" And he said, "Well," he said, "one of them is about the home front, the people at home during the war, and the other is about the war in the Pacific." And I said, his name was Kim Lemaster, and I said, "Kim, do you have 5 minutes? Because I'd like to explain World War II to you." It's a somewhat presumptuous thing to say, but it got his attention. And he laughed and said, "Okay." I said, "Look," and I told him the story about even the bad guys have to be attractive, the comic book editor's story. And I said, "The problem you got with the war against the Japanese is," I said, "the enemy was really unattractive. They were short and bow-legged, and they wore crappy-looking uniforms. And you can't beat the Nazis for being top-notch bad guys because they were all tall and blonde and gorgeous and had blue eyes, and they wore these great uniforms with skulls and crossbones and death's heads on them, and they were pure evil. I mean, how can you beat that for bad guys? We are fascinated by them at the same time that we're repelled by them." Well, the end result was he bought my script. He gave me the assignment. So, secondary characters, don't throw them away. Don't just have a ticket clerk at the bus stop, at the bus station, hand your character the ticket if you need to play that he or she is buying a ticket. Give the character an attitude, a condition. You know, his wife threw him out that morning, or he's got indigestion, or he's constipated, or whatever. Just make him interesting. Yes?
But I watched the movie Castaway last night.
Yeah.
What about the character Wilson?
Well, that was...
Did they do it without him?
I don't think so, but I mean, Castaways was a movie. It falls into a category of mine, which is why did they make this movie? There wasn't a single surprise in that movie until he tried to deliver the package at the end and she wasn't at home. Everything else, every other moment in that movie, from Helen Hunt going back to her husband, to him learning how to break a coconut, make a fire, spearfish, there wasn't a single surprise in the movie. It made me nuts. But yeah, certainly that was a cute device, and to their credit, it made that tedious sequence on the island almost bearable. But that's about as positive as I'll get about it. I mean, I have no idea why that. I mean, let me put it this way: the biggest hype for this movie is that Tom Hanks lost 40 pounds. You know, that's so. I rest my case.
I saw 13 Days last night, and there's a scene in which they focus in on the telephone operators at the White House. There's one in the whole line of them that is distinctive, and it comes back about, you kind of wonder why is she there, and then it comes back, I don't know, in the third of the way through the movie, and it utilized this character and her attitude to get the attention of a pilot that's going to be going out with long mission of.
So there was a reason why the character was flagged.
Talk with the cigarette hanging out. Now you know their meeting.
Sure. Well, that's good stuff. Yeah. But they delivered. Good. But anyway, as I said, don't shoehorn. I'm running a little over, but I hope you won't mind if you'll give me a few more minutes. Don't shoehorn. Let them breathe. Don't fight your characters. Listen to them. Your dialogue should uniquely delineate your characters. There's a test I use in television and screenwriting. If you can change the character name above a block of dialogue without rewriting the dialogue, you're doing it wrong. That's it. No two people will say hello, how are you the same way. If you've created your characters so that you really understand them, so that they're individuals to you, you will find that you have to rewrite it, even slightly, but you have to change it. And if you don't, as I said, it's not right. Have your characters withhold. Have them tell lies and secrets. Characters with secrets are more interesting by far and more human than people who just flat out say, "Oh yeah, this is the way I feel." We all withhold. Explaining why they did something. Beware of letting your characters explain yourself. Think about the people you know. How many of them can really explain why they behave the way they do? Not very many. Ergo, if you're trying to create believable characters, people can give you explanations and rationales. But for instance, the guy who buys the Jaguar sports car, who tells you that he buys it because of the way it handles and the this and then that, it's an extension of his penis. That's why he bought it. The rest of it is all to make it civilized and make it for polite company. It was a sexy car to him. And so, don't have your characters, in short, explain themselves fully. It's better, by the way, if you need to have a character explained, let another character do it. either to them or to another character. It's like, think of the conversations you have with your friends or people, you know, about third parties. And, well, you know, Charlie always does X because he's got this problem with his mother and, you know, that, you know, and he never got over having skin trouble when he was 14 and, you know, all of that stuff. Try to make every character, every line of dialogue unique to that character, say something about that character. Now, you can't do it 100% of the time, but it's something to shoot for. It's an ideal. After you've written your speeches and your dialogue, go through and cut them. Do I really need this sentence? Do I really need those words? Less is more. Write subtext. What are the characters really talking about? What is really going on in this transaction? Rather than, and very often you know, for your own edification at the beginning, you might start out writing all surface conversation, but then go back into it and say, how can, you know, would this character really be that upfront with this information? Avoid on-the-nose dialogue. We shorten it to OTN. Write what you want your characters to say, if you're new at this game, and then rewrite it so that it's interesting and tantalizing and elliptical or otherwise inarticulate. Most people are not very articulate. People foomfa. People say, you know. People say, you know what I mean? I write that as one word when I write dialogue. It's stuff that you hear. Now, obviously, there is an important distinction between written dialogue and real dialogue. It's different. It isn't exactly the same. If you read transcriptions of tapes, a speech into words. Very frequently in television writing and film writing, the final question you ask as you're going through your dialogue is, does this really need to be said as a word? Can I do it with a gesture? Wouldn't it be better if we directed the character's reaction so that he looks off at a spot on the wall or something like that? Isn't that maybe in that situation more effective than actually answering the question or responding with just words that are filled? Write the silences, write the gestures. And verbal exposition, by all means, do avoid writing, well, you are my sister, or, you know, well, we did go to college together. That's really poverty-stricken writing. It gets used all the time, and it's terrible. And if I were running the show, it wouldn't happen. But you shouldn't do it. Try to find another way to say, she's my sister, or, you know, he's my brother. Try and find an elliptical way to say it so it isn't just bang on, you are my sister, you are my lawyer. As your lawyer, I have to, you know, that's terrible. Don't do that. Don't tombstone. I talked about that earlier. Repeating words all through your manuscript. Don't tell the audience what it already knows. Don't repeat information in your story. The audience retains what it's seen and heard. Don't have your character. The only place I've ever seen them get away with it effectively was on Seinfeld, where they were constantly telling one of the characters, Elaine would tell George what just went on in the previous scene, which we had just seen. They got away with it because they are the greatest comedy ensemble group since Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell. But I wouldn't recommend it as a way of writing. And in truth, I mean, what worked in that show was the reactions were so funny that we didn't mind that they repeated the whole thing. But generally speaking, it's not a good idea. think picture, think dialogue, a screenwriter's approach. Start with your sides, your dialogue sides. I would sometimes just, start typing dialogue. And then, as I said, begin to cut off the ends, minimize flat-footed description, unless your name is F. Scott Fitzgerald. What I mean by that is, in narrative writing, a lot of scene description I find makes my eyes glaze over. Cold Mountain, which is a very good novel, very literary, a little self-consciously literary, but for my money, it could have done with a lot less of the descriptions of the color of the leaves and the trees, because it was just too much for me and for my taste. I guess some people like to read that stuff, but I'd rather get on with the story myself. Recommended dialogue writers: John O'Hara, Dashiell Hammett, Preston Sturgis, William Goldman. They're all down there in front of you. Clifford Odets, Joe Mankiewicz.
The length of the TV script is going to be different.
Oh yeah, well the length of an hour TV script is approximately 52 to 60 pages. They prefer, they'll make you cut it if you write 60 pages. It's basically 47 minutes of drama. And the half-hour shows run anywhere from 25 to 35 pages. And again, those are only 22 minutes long. Anyway, this is questions now, so please feel free to.
Regarding what you said about the audience feeling satisfied at the end, what do you think about not answering all the questions that?
Oh, I think that's perfectly fair. I don't think you have to wrap everything up in a bow. That's not what I mean by audience satisfaction. I think leaving them hanging is a wonderful way to go. In novel writing, it's known as the blockbuster ending. It's the whoa, and you start writing the rest of the story in your head. So no, absolutely, it is not necessary to tie up all the loose ends. Generally speaking, in mysteries, they do it. They don't call them cozies for nothing. Anyway, any other questions, please?
Making something work with you, otherwise come to you.
Sometimes. In television, you don't have a lot of time. Comedy, they do more than in drama. In drama, you don't have a lot of time for fooling around on the set, because you got to shoot 8 pages a day, and so it's bang, 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 and the director is there mostly as a traffic cop to keep the actors from bumping into the set and so on. And you're mostly, on a show like Murder, She Wrote, where words were so important, where one word was a key, there was an ironclad rule that no actors could change a single word of the dialogue without permission. But I've been on a lot of other shows where it was a lot more flexible than that, and sometimes the actors help the scenes and sometimes they don't. Unfortunately, when you're producing a series, a dramatic series, you got so many other things that you're doing that you can't be on the set all the time. In fact, you can almost never be on the set because you're so busy with the other stuff. So, but yes, absolutely. In directing plays, actors will come up with ideas that, say a thing better than, what the writer wrote.
I've watched Seinfeld's scripts at Borders.
Have you?
Yeah, I have. You can get almost any screenplay at Borders you can order.
Oh, that's terrific to know. Thank you for everybody here.
In television, you get a formula that works terrific for one show, works great for a season. Over time, the formula gets stale, so I don't know if this was a problem for you at Murder, She Wrote. I assume that it was.
Yeah, go ahead.
What do you do to shake it up?
Well, sometimes we didn't do it much on Murder, She Wrote. The thing seemed to work. We did introduce a couple of outside characters. At one point, for instance, we had an on and off guest character, a sort of a classic seedy private eye played by Jerry Orbach, Harry McGraw. And I produced a spin-off from that, which was, by the way, my happiest experience in television. Working with Jerry was the best. And we had a wonderful time with the show. So then later on, we hadn't used Jerry in several years, and I was doing an episode that was based actually on, it was a truncated version of the novel that I just published. And it needed that kind of character. So I called Jerry in New York, and he couldn't do the show because he had just signed on for a Law and Order. So I created a similar character for Wayne Rogers, Charlie Garrett, and so on. But that show didn't require that much tinkering. You know, whether it was your favorite or not. I mean, it had its audience, and a lot of people watched it. But yeah, I mean, an example of that kind of thing is seen in shows like ER, where either the personnel changes or the actors, you know, partly because actors, agents love to tell their clients that they're going to be movie stars, and so they pass up $1 million a year for no career. That happens over and over. You know, you see them inject other elements, you know, and it's always a battle to try and juice the show up. X-Files is another one.
How many relatives did Jessica have?
She didn't, well actually we used fewer and fewer of her relatives. She had a nephew at one point, I forget the actor's name, and I wrote a couple of shows for him, and early on, in fact the first episode I wrote, and then one day he came in, it was Peter Fisher was still running the show at the time, and they wanted to use the nephew, and so Peter called the agent, and the agent said, well, his price has just gone from $5,000 to $15,000 an episode, and that was the end of the nephew.
You've probably been asked this a million times, but I saw a stand-up comedian once asked as a joke, you know, Murder, She Wrote, everywhere she went somebody died, and was anybody ever going to suspect her? You know?
Well, we used to refer to her around the show as the Angel of Death, and we had two, I've mentioned this to a couple of people one-on-one since I've been here, but we had two scenarios that we always wanted to do. One was that she arrives in a town and everybody runs. You know, she gets off the train and, and everybody takes off. And the other was that, one of them was that Cabot Cove was the murder capital of America. And the other one was at the end of the show, had anyone ever considered that she may be the major serial killer of the 20th century?
You talk about a certain amount of pages for a half-hour show or an hour show. You're talking about double spacing.
No, I'm talking about screenplay form. Screenplay form for the hour shows. There's a sitcom form. Most of you are familiar with these formatting programs that provide you with the proper formatting. They do it a little differently for the tape shows. Did you have another question?
Yeah,
Oh.
I have just one more. You mentioned avoiding cliches when you can, and you watch shows over time and you tend to see cliches develop within the show. As a writer, how do you avoid, once you notice that something's working in the show, and you're tempted because you know you're going to get a laugh, or like Halloween Field, when it first came out, it was just loaded with its own cliches and all the characters. And I can see at a certain point, the audience getting worn on those, and yet the writer still feeling like, boy, this is such a good opportunity for me to throw in another cage or fishism or whatever.
Yeah.
For me, the entertainment on it.
Well, it's funny. Sometimes writers fall in love with their work too much, you know, and it's a disease we can all catch, and it's tough to avoid. I don't know the answer. I think it's really a sense for me, since I've been there, of who's running the show. I'll give you a confession, which I'm almost sheepish to admit to. I'm a member of the Television Academy, and for about 4 or 5 seasons, you volunteered to judge for the Emmys, and I volunteered to judge for the dramatic shows. And my main motivation, other than that it was sort of social and you meet, you know, a lot of people and you schmooze, was I wanted to vote against Homicide. which was one of those shows that is mysterious in its success to me, right up there with Chuck Norris and other strange phenomena. I mean, to me, it was the most wretchedly written show. I didn't believe a single moment or a single character in the show, and it appalled me that it got all this critical acclaim, and so I wanted to do whatever I could to vote it down. It tells you how shallow and nasty a guy can be.
So with all the information that we have on writing and 100 years of filming and all that, why do they still produce a bad movie? Why is there a bad movie? Why is there a bad show ever?
Oh, that's an interesting question. There are not a lot of Shakespeares around at any given moment in time. There are not a lot of geniuses abroad in the land.
We know the rules, though.
Yeah, but even then, you know, you can screw anything up. You know, not you, any of us. but let me. I'm going to do a little monologue if you've got maybe a few more minutes. Is it okay? Yeah. All right. About what you're up against in Hollywood today. I did this for some people at dinner last night, and nobody reads in Hollywood. They have readers, and the readers do what they call coverage. The readers are usually 23-year-old graduates of Sarah Lawrence or Berkeley English majors, and they get paid to read the scripts that come in from agents, from writers over the transom, however they come in. And they do a 2 or 3 page document on it that is called coverage. It's been going on for years. I mean, even in the old days of the studios, they did it when the old studio system existed. Over the last 10 or 15 years, there are 4 people who have become variously millionaires or almost millionaires or multimillionaires from being self-appointed gurus on how scripts should be written. I will name them for you. John Truby, McKee, I forget his first name, Bob McKee, I think, Robert McKee, Linda Seeger, and the fourth is Sid Fields. Now, these are all estimable people, but between the 4 of them, they've written books, they do seminars, S-type seminars for $300 or more a weekend to teach you how to write screenplays. And most of them have created great wealth from it as being the world's greatest authorities on writing screenplays. None of them have earned 28 cents writing movies, but they got all the answers for how you should write them and what the formula is. And they have, I think, screwed up the movie business more than anything in the last 10 or 15 years, because the readers read based on this matrix that these people have concocted. What they've done is they've deconstructed, each one has chosen 3 or 4 movies that they've deconstructed and broken down into a formula. And that's what you're up against. they literally, as we say somewhat crudely, wouldn't recognize a good screenplay if it came up and bit them on the ass. And it's a serious problem. It's a really, really serious problem. And I'm not, you know, I'm not just grousing. William Goldman, who wrote Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, among other things, recently wrote a new book called More Adventures in the Screen Trade. His first book, Adventures in the Screen Trade, is one of the great landmark books that everyone should read. The new one isn't quite as good, but his reason for writing it was what was so telling. He said that he went back to Oberlin, his alma mater, to give a talk a couple of years ago, and he was immediately accosted by a breathless 20-year-old female undergraduate screenwriter who said, Mr. Goldman, do you always introduce your secondary theme on page 17? That's what we are all up against, and that's why they make such lousy movies. You know, the market is different. The marketplace is different. And it's, you know, in practical terms, you can make a very nice living as a writer in television, if you're lucky and if you've got some talent. That's not to say that you won't get lucky. There's a movie just got made by written by some guy who filming, huh? Yeah, Finding Forrester. Yeah. So it does happen. Does it happen a lot? No. I mean, part of it is, you know, every artist, every creative person, even the most successful, are. Did I? What did I do? I must have pushed a button here. I'm sorry. Every artist is, and you're not alone. All of us, everybody in this room is secretly, furtively pissed off that the world hasn't realized how beautiful and talented we are and carried us off on their shoulders without our having to do anything but what we do creatively. Isn't that true? You know, we resent it terribly. I mean, don't they know who we are? You know, well, let me tell you, it rarely works that way. So you got to go out and flog it. You got to go out. I mean, if you write a movie script, you know, you got a room full of people here, and the ones who are going to be here this afternoon who are filmmakers. And you got studios over at Chambers, and you got locations around here. Try and get a little movie made here. That's realistic. You know, with local financing. It's getting cheaper. I mean, it went up and up and up, and now it's cheaper. Anyway, I don't want to keep you. It's now 11:45, and I thank you very, very much for your attentiveness, and I hope this has been a worthwhile experience for you. It's been my pleasure. And if you want to buy any books, commerce rears its ugly head. If you want to buy any, but I will go and sign them in the office in there. And as far as my novel, if you want to order it, just tell me what it is you want inscribed on it, and I'll send it to you next week when they get off the truck.
You can also